I begin with a detour to 19th century France, where naturalism was first a genre of urban fiction. In the text, which is considered a popular manifesto of naturalism, the Préface to Germiny Laqueur, Edmond and Jules Goncourt warned their readers that their novel came from the street. And although it was pure, it was not beautiful, they said. Moreover, they complained that the people had been deprived of their right to the novel. This is my awkward translation, but it's very faithful to the original. We asked ourselves whether those referred to as the lower classes did not have a right to the novel, whether this world, situated below another world, the people, had to remain under a literary interdiction and subject to the disdain of authors who so far have remained silent on the subject of the people's soul and heart. The Goncourt brothers aimed to expose society's hypocritical adherence to a rhetoric of equality and demanded that the life of the poor be dignified by being taken up as the proper subject of the novel. This new subject, moreover, would require a different aesthetic because realism was not rigorous enough to capture the magnitude of the people's suffering. Although critics have been cautious about the Goncourt's sincerity, taking notice of their tendency to sensationalize the putrid and ugly, naturalism after the Goncourts continued to make a committed stance for the people, especially in the work of Émile Zola. Naturalism gives shape to the people's narrative, in which, as Zola said in L'Assommoir, the people have the smell of the people. His progressive politics and solidarity with the people, moreover, complicate the distance implied in the spectacle of suffering. The link between humanitarian narrative and naturalism is also made by the historian Thomas Laqueur, who identifies in the 18th century a new cluster of narratives that came to speak in extraordinarily detailed fashion about the pains and deaths of ordinary people in such a way as to make apparent the causal chains that might connect the actions of its readers with the suffering of its subjects. By the middle of the 19th century, humanitarian sensibilities are so much assumed that they go unspoken in the naturalist novel. Laqueur's definition of humanitarian narrative announces as its subject the ordinary people, but it also registers a distance between these ordinary people who are suffering and the consumer or reader of the narrative. It points out what Luli Huriaraki has called the theatricality of humanitarianism and its reliance on the spectacle of suffering. Although the object of the narrative is to reveal the causal chains that might connect the readers to the sufferers, it is hard to miss the conditional construction of Laqueur's phrase. Humanitarian narrative, bound as it is to the cause and effect structure of historical emplotment, deals with the anxiety about its own effectiveness by being prescriptive. It enunciates, he tells us, a detailed matrix of cause and effect, specific wrong and specific action, and thus an analytic of suffering exposes the means of its relief. Okay, so it's always kind of telling you, by showing you the suffering, what you're supposed to do about it. Two features of Laqueur's definition need further elucidation. The emphasis on how naturalism brings the particularity of the people into focus, and the insistence on the mechanism of a causal logic. Laqueur was very cognizant that humanitarian narrative takes as its subject the suffering of ordinary people, and that it succeeds in placing them at the center by accumulating lots of details as the sign of truth. Unprecedented quantities of fact, of minute observations about people who had before been beneath notice, become the building blocks of the reality effect, of the literary technique through which the experiences of others are represented as real in the humanitarian narrative. Unlike Lynn Hunt, and this is a point that is important to those who are interested in the new histories of the human rights ideology, if you want, or movement. So unlike Lynn Hunt, who's one of the main historians of the human rights movement, who identifies in a similar moment in the 18th century the emergence of an identity of the human, a universal man, on which a theory of moral sentiments is attached that provides the underpinnings for an ideology of human rights, Laqueur insists on the term ordinary people rather than humanity, and aligns this aesthetics with naturalism rather than sentimentalism. Moreover, he consciously limits the scope of this discourse and argues that although it had the ability to address a variety of circumstances, it did not address itself to the universal, but always to the particular. Humanitarian narratives created sympathetic passions, bridged the gulf between facts and compassion. Bridged the gulf between facts, compassion, and action in a wide variety of places and circumstances, but by no means exclusively or universally. So Laqueur is, for me, the preferred source for understanding the emergence of these ideas over Lynn Hunt's emphasis on universal man. The causal logic of Laqueur, the causal logic Laqueur highlights closely identifies humanitarianism with naturalism. Zola similarly emphasized naturalism's attention to cause and effect, and went so far as to suggest that the novel be thought of quite literally as a scientific experiment. Naturalism's insistence on determinism, which Zola cautions us is not the same as fatalism, reflects this preoccupation with cause and effect, with a how. A set of conditions leads to a particular outcome. The ending is rarely in doubt. The novelist's commitment to a sense of the real precludes the irrational or the supernatural. The path to the outcome, however, provides infinitely rich ground for the novelist's observation. Despite Zola's disclaimer that the novelist is not an inventor of plot, he highlights instead the novelist's recreating of setting and circumstance, on which the truthfulness of this observation, the truthfulness of his observation of human behavior depends. So you might remember Zola's variables in his experimental novel, which are heredity and environment. Heredity as an idea features less prominently in the war novel, but environment is all important. The novels of war are defined by the mise en scène. War is a determining environment. The environment is a constitutive element, part of war's definition of what it is, an environment in which man appears as different from what he normally is, his true self now unmasked. This exposes a degraded instead of a heroic self, usually hidden by the softening touches of quotidian life. However, insofar as war novels draw a distinct boundary defining the space of this particular environment apart from the time of peace, one cannot always generalize from the specific circumstance of war to man's condition as a whole. What war shows about human animality, which is a common phrase one finds, belongs to war, and the novels are at pains to fix that boundary. Okay, so the novels create a space that is bounded within which war is taking place and try to demarcate that as something different. And the man they find at war is different from the man that we find in peace. And by man, I mean man in general, right? When occupying the perspective from within war, the novels show the environment as all-determining. Thus, in Ken Saro-Wiwa's Sosa Boy, war is explained by the oft-repeated tautology, war is war. Why do things happen in war? Because war is war. That's a quotation from the novel. We also find this in the classic text of World War I, Eric Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, where it is pronounced as self-evident. After all, war is war. So the same phrase appears in that novel as well. This illogic reflects naturalism's emphasis on how rather than why. The why of war answers itself. War is war. Perhaps it does not, presenting us with the circular logic of a closed environment. The how of war, what it means in practice and in the experience of those subsumed by it, however, is revealed as knowable through observation. Because war is seen as an environment apart in this literature, the novelists make vivid a resistance to war, the intense desire to get outside it, which hints at a higher order of human aspiration and agency. Often, however, this is an elusive goal. The problem of the contiguity and possible continuity between spheres becomes acute in novels of war, as for example, cases where the African novels portray the guerrilla war and life in the forest as acquiring characteristics of civilian life. In Taste of Death, a novel about the Mau Mau, one of the guerrillas is able to visit his wife surreptitiously because the village is very near the forest, until they're both betrayed and she's killed. And this is the illustration from the novel that shows her being shot. Let me see if I can actually point. You see there, she's being shot at and killed. War, therefore, spills out of the forest, but domesticity has also intruded into the life of the combatant. And if I remember correctly, you can see the husband here as he's coming out to meet her, or to warn her. And it's a pretty accurate illustration, except that it's quite decorative, as you can see, of what happens in the novel. Okay, it is easy to see why naturalism lends itself to depictions of war. It can portray death and physical suffering exhaustively. It protests against, but also documents a determinism that foregrounds the power of the environment, political, social, and physical, over individual will, and it is hyperbolic and angry, as in Festus Iyahi's phrase, people were the vermin that fed on the vomit. The focus on human suffering in war often forces us to look up close at the injured body and adopt the almost hallucinatory perspective of those with horrific injuries. Wounds are examined in minute detail, but so is the activity of injuring, which places the reader in the uncomfortable position of engaging with the physical effort of maiming and killing. Compulsive behavior, another naturalist feature, is also amply apparent, especially in the depiction of the victim perpetrators, those reluctantly drawn into violence, who after being traumatized become compulsively violent. More broadly, the depiction of victimization of individuals whose agency is severely compromised is common and adversely affects the ability of these characters to be written into tragic stories and elevated into hero or martyr status. The literature instead posits a deeply skeptical and even satiric attitude towards heroism. We can turn to Mwangi again. He was the author of Taste of Death, a novel whose illustration I showed you, for an example. In his other novel about the Mau Mau, he presents the following portrait of the guerrilla commander. Consumed by hatred and the suffering from his putrid wound, Haraka fantasizes about revenge incessantly. As he becomes physically and morally repulsive, he undergoes a transformation that makes him a personification of war. Haraka fantasizes that he saw the face of the district commissioner, tall, proud, and white and hateful, D.C. Kingsley and his mascot, Simba. The general's eye bored into the two, and his hate was for them. His body was bathed in perspiration as the warm waves of pain and revenge washed over him, periodically making the veins of his face and neck dance excitedly. As he watched the two images, the heads fell off one by one. Haraka's desire for revenge becomes a madness. Physically incapacitated, he insistently calls for his men to get him Chief Simba's head. The novel's title, borrowed from Shakespeare, signals a revision of the original meaning. And here's the quotation from Shakespeare: "Let's kill him boldly, but not wrathfully. Let's carve him as a dish fit for the gods." This is Julius Caesar, by the way. Not hew him as a carcass fit for hounds. And so the title of the novel is Carcass Fit for Hounds. So it shows precisely that they're going to kill in ways that are not this way. Haraka's trusted deputy, who struggles with the moral dilemma of whether to obey his commander's mad orders but ultimately succumbs to the pressure, is also shown as the tender of the commander's wound, a role which captures metaphorically his dependence and secondariness. As the nurse of Haraka's wound, Kimano had milked the wound of its weakening pus. He had squeezed the ugly lips until the granite eyes watered and a mixture of blood and water oozed out of the wound. Here we have an excellent example of the naturalistic aesthetic of war fiction, right? The attention to the minute attention to the wound and the kind of language that evokes. Characterizing the endings of naturalist novels more generally, M.H. Abrams explains that the protagonist of the naturalistic plot, a pawn to multiple compulsions, usually disintegrates or is wiped out. The idea that war turns man into a pawn, depriving him of agency and humanity, is reflected precisely in the title of another novel, this one from Zimbabwe, Charles Samupindi's Pawns. The disintegration of the individual, moreover, is usually literal, as he's blown up, consumed by an injury, or otherwise destroyed by war. Neil Lazarus cautions us not to conflate African naturalism with European naturalism, because the determinism that makes the characters in naturalist fiction seem to lack agency is not at play in post-colonial literature, that for Lazarus clearly functions as protest literature. The African works, Lazarus argues, are not fatalistic, even when they portray settings that are exceedingly bleak. The characters instead display a resilience that is negative, contentless, illustrative only of sheer resistance, that's Lazarus's phrase, and point to the inevitability of some kind of implosion of the system. Their negativity is their agency, Lazarus says. And leaving aside, therefore, the debate whether Zola's determinism is fatalistic or not, Lazarus's insistence on the message of protest is consistent with the war literature's aim to show that war is unproductive and wholly destructive. The war novel's resistance seeks to draw out the particular features of war and make the confrontation with its negative nature inescapable. The proliferation of detail that attracts Laqueur's attention characterizes a hyperrealism that seeks to uncover historical truth in minute details, often focusing on the body, and has a similar intent to force a confrontation with the uncomfortable reality of suffering.